You are watching Conscious Evolution with Wes Heffernan.
Well, you gotta have fuel to go. And I'm not just talking about gasoline. In the nature of just living in the moment and following the route, we found this cool little spot right here. Or actually, maybe I should say this cool little destination to eat. Let's go check it out. The journey down Route 66, all this stuff's going on internally for me. And one of the things that, again, was being pointed out was what's between A and B. Is that one step? Like, well, from A to B is one step, right? Well, no, it's not. Because there's a night and a day. And so there's two steps there, right? And I began contemplating what that meant. And is it just two steps, or can there be multiple night and days? And this idea of frame rate began to come into play. And so now you have between point A and point B, how many frames do you want to put in there? And now we're getting into, is time real or not, right? And so if a frame represents 1 second and you put 2 frames between A and B, well, it takes me 2 seconds to get from A to B. But if I need 100 frames in order to get there, then it's going to take me longer, but it's the same distance, right? And so the concept of frame rate, which shooting and editing these videos
30 frames a second
really brought to life, a year or so ago, this concept of frame rate. But it gets tricky when you start thinking about it, because if you add more frames, right, like if you want to shoot slow motion,
right,
you want to shoot at 120 frames per second. And so, like, contemplating that, but wait a minute, it seems like if I put more frames in there, it's going to take me longer. Come back to perspective and perception, right? And so when you look at Einstein's theory of relativity, right? And so you have what you as the observer or witness see, and then you have the one that's actually living. And so if I put 120 frames between my point A and point B, right, you're only going to see, the mind works at 24 frames per second is what the general is. And so if you're only catching 24 of those 100 frames, I'm doing a bunch of stuff in between some of those points of reference that you're not seeing. And so, like, it's almost Easter, right? Let's bring Jesus into this for a minute. So, like, how, just thinking of some of the miracles, like, how would Jesus go about feeding all these people with, a loaf of bread and fish and one fish or whatever? Well, there's a lot going on. Jesus is operating at, like, 240 frames per second? And so there's so much. And I'm being a little bit funny with this analogy, but literally he could go catch a fish and come back and feed you, right? And while you're eating, you never see him leave, because you're only seeing 1 out of every 10 frames at 24 frames per second that you're observing. And he's operating at 240. And so for him, for Christ, he's moving at a natural pace, right? But if, again, observer, witness, and here's Jesus, so the observer would see him moving really fast, crazy, right? But the witness is going to see him moving slow. And that's the relationship between slow motion and frame rates. But something else frame rate applies to is also your pixel count. And this is like a dualistic turn on frame rates, right? You're adding more information to the story. And so you're adding greater detail.
Right.
And then what was brought to my attention was a frame. We'll pull this back out. A frame is two-dimensional. I know there's 3 dimensions here, but like a line itself has width, but you're thinking of it in a two-dimensional terms. It has a up and down and a left and right. Mm-hmm. And so if you pull this frame out and you look at it, it's now a two-dimensional concept. But how do you add depth to it, right? And so you're stretching, so we can choose as an individual to live our entire life within one frame. And we can make that frame our entire life, right? Or we can begin letting go, and we can begin frame to frame. We can go a night and a day, and we can go from A to B, but if we never live through that night and a day, we continue the same story, the same frame. And in that is painful, because you're stretching it, right? And you're pulling it. And your timeline, right? You know, the idea of never tasting death or never having to experience death, if we're constantly recreating ourselves in every frame, you're recreating a new version of yourself. Your timeline starts over, right? The idea of birth and death exists within a single frame.
Or your dash.
Or your dash, right. And so, like where I was talking, you know, man, it really opened my mind up. This entity, this feminine, very feminine entity, I mean, I'm gonna say Gaia, right? Mother Earth, began showing me things that made so much sense, pulling all these pieces and creating this puzzle. It was so much more detailed than what I have ever imagined, even though maybe I felt or thought like it wasn't real. It was still just here in my mind. But I'm living it now with purpose and intent, to know, to pull the 3 parts together. And while, you know, those 3 parts to tell this story are the 3 channels, it's really about putting together and allowing yourself to fall into your own story. And that's dying on the cross. Like what does dying on the cross means? It means falling into your story. And so when you look at the archway, and you have point A and you have point B, right? And in between is that story to get there. If you stay in the observer perspective, the mental perspective, and all you do is you sit there and you watch, you're living in one frame. You can't move to that other frame until you fall into the story, right? The fall of man. Think of it as a bad thing. We're taught that it's this evil concept that, you know, well, I mean, yeah, okay, maybe if you look at it as I want to become more, I want to experience more, I want to know more about myself, right? And if you think of that in terms of me, an individual, or any of you as an individual, that seems like maybe, okay, that's selfish. And in that sense, in the story of the Garden of Eden, right, there's some darkness or evilness, because it's I, little me, want more, when there is no more, right? But I want to experience more. And I mean, that's the whole purpose of evolution. From no thing to something to all things is God. The single idea or concept, whatever that may represent to any of you, I'm gonna call it God, experiencing who God is.
Thanks for watching. Join us next time on Conscious Evolution. Don't forget to subscribe.